David's not laughing right now. I think I better get on to the serious part of the case. Usually when I talk about this case, or the independent movement in general, I tend to talk about the people that were the pioneers of the movement, the people that started the whole thing, the David Mayos, the Julie Mayos, the Sarge Gerbodis, Maud Castillos, those people that dedicated their lives to the technology and spent decades in the pursuit of excellence in the technology, and then were asked to leave because of the problems of the current administration of the church. So usually I define the case in those terms, and those are clearly very realistic terms, and they mean an awful lot to me after being associated with David and his staff these many months, and now I think we're getting into years. But there's another side of this case, because I think most of you are familiar with that particular side of the case. There's another side of the case that I didn't learn about until I started traveling around all over the country, responding to these notices of deposition filed by the church. And I have learned of a side that I feel entails the very strength of the defendant's position in this case, and that is the strength of the independent movement across the country, if not worldwide. I have been to depositions from Florida to Denver to Hawaii, Los Angeles, too many times to reiterate here. And what I've discovered is that there's a commitment to this case on the part of those independents that are practicing in the field, not affiliated with David or the Advanced Stability Center, but those independent Scientology auditors that practice independently from the church that now feel that this case represents their future. And I think that is one of the most significant developments that I have witnessed since the case has started. I think the case had that unifying aspect of the independent movement that was lacking before. And let me give you a couple of examples. And by no means are these the only or the exclusive examples, but just a couple that came to mind. There's a woman sitting over here to my left in the third row, Mary Marin. And she at one time was affiliated with the Advanced Stability Center as an auditor. And then she and Frankie Friedman, who you probably are familiar with, went down to Los Angeles and they started their own practice down there where they followed their own beliefs and their own spiritual counseling techniques, and which is clearly predicated upon their training in the church and their further training at the Advanced Stability Center. And Mary got a notice of deposition, and as far as I knew, she was one of the first ones in the independent field. And I was really sort of apprehensive going into that deposition, not knowing how the independent field would consider this case, whether they would consider it as a threat, whether they would consider themselves to be intimidated by the might of the church and their attorneys and the money and the effort that they can bring to bear upon people that they feel need to be pressured or need to be coerced. And in listening to Mary for the hours and hours that she gave her testimony, I kind of sensed a truthfulness or an inner integrity that would not be compromised by the pressure of the church or the church's attorneys. And when I left that deposition, I told her, Mary, I somewhat feel like this is a turning point in this case because I think things are going to go very well from this point on. And I think those were true words when I said that, because all my observations since then have been in conformity with that belief that I had. And I feel very indebted to the people such as Mary who have put their own well-being or their own selfish interests aside to testify truthfully in this case. It would be easy to say, no, we're not doing any of these techniques, or we don't believe in this techniques, or it's something entirely different, but that's not the way she testified. She says, yes, this is what I do, this is why I do it, I believe in it, and I'm going to continue to do so. Some months after Mary Marin's deposition, the church noticed another deposition in the convenient locality of Miami, Florida, in the middle of summer. And that deposition was of a Mr. Ken Urquhart, and I called the church attorney and I said, look, I understand Ken will be coming to California in the fall. Why don't we just wait? Surely, with all the depositions you're going to take in this case, you do not need to have this one taken in the middle of the summer in Miami on fairly short notice. He said, no, absolutely, we have to go forward. And so off to Florida we went. It was myself and John Ziegel, and Ken actually had to fly down from New Jersey just to be there in Florida for his deposition. So it was a terrible inconvenience, and certainly I consider to be an unnecessary expenditure of funds, but we went. And Ken is a little different than Mary. He is an independent auditor, and he's no longer affiliated with the Advanced Ability Center, although he too was at one time affiliated with the center. But Ken, as I learned as his deposition went on and on that day in Florida, had spent many, many, many years in the church and at the highest levels of church authority. He had been in the church since the early or mid-60s, and he stayed in it until the early 80s. And during that period of time, for many years, in the late 60s and 70s up to the mid-70s, he held the post of L. Ron Hubbard communicator, wherein he actually lived with L. Ron Hubbard aboard the ship and later at the land locations. And he lived with that individual on a daily basis. And the reason why he continued for those many years was very clear in his deposition, that he had the utmost respect and admiration for L. Ron Hubbard and the utmost devotion, which is why he had spent those many years of his life working for that person for something like $20 a week. And he had the utmost respect and devotion for Mary Sue Hubbard and for what she stood for, at least as concerns the technology and the preservation thereof. And I was concerned because at the close of that deposition, I knew we needed the knowledge that he would have to have had with that close relationship with L. Ron Hubbard, that we would need to use that in this case because we were seeking to compel the testimony of L. Ron Hubbard. And I knew that would force a very difficult question upon an individual that had spent that many years working under such a close personal relationship with L. Ron Hubbard and under Mary Sue Hubbard. And at the end of that deposition, I said, Ken, I realize what you have been through. I realize you do not like lawsuits, and particularly this suit. I realize, as he reiterated in his deposition, he felt it was very sad that the church is now suing David Mayo, and now David Mayo is forced to defend himself against the church and file a countersuit. Those were his words, very, very sad. He says, I understand your feelings about this, but would you be willing to come out to California and do a deposition for me to establish the relationship of L. Ron Hubbard to the corporate entities known as the Church of Scientology? And he thought about it for a while, and he says, what time do you want me there? Last Monday, we spent approximately 8 hours in a deposition with Mr. Urquhart. His testimony is absolutely flawless. It is down to the last detail. If any of you are concerned or want to know about what it was like to be L. Ron Hubbard's communicator and be on the ship in the 60s, Dave is laughing because he feels he already knows.